Hey everyone, it's Wednesday here on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We've got Ray Fittipaldo on the show, and we're going to be talking about the story that came from our own newspaper about how Arthur Smith and Russell Wilson weren't seeing eye to eye and how that might have changed how the Steelers offense was performing at the tail end of the season. We'll talk about that, Ray's perspective on what the Steelers was doing with George Pickens, and a big rush receiver name on the trade market. Will the Steelers make a move for him or someone else? All here in the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Let's get into it.
You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter.
Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Ray Fittipaldo, one of our great Steelers beat writers. And as always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this show if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as all of the daily podcasts that we do here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, you can subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at post-gazette.com. And as always, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you're injured in a car accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injured victims for over 40 years recover more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one have been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, Gerry Dulac, our partner here, we'll put out a really big story earlier this week about the clashing of Arthur Smith and Russell Wilson, how they butted heads over Steelers offensive philosophy. You all can read that at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette by going to post-gazette.com, clicking on that Steelers header. But he noted that part of the clashing was it was Russell Wilson's ability to change calls at the line of scrimmage, adjust plays, add in routes. And we don't know exactly when specifically that change happened. However, he pointed out that, like, against the Bengals, that's what Russell Wilson was doing in the first time around, that he was able to call adjustments out. They were able to get the ball out. Things were going fine. And then you saw in that second game, we were all wondering what was so different about how they played the Bengals the first time versus the second time. And this seems to be the biggest point of evidence to say, like, hey, the veteran quarterback who had all the experience, maybe it was about him being able to change plays at the line of scrimmage and adjust plays at the line of scrimmage to what the defense was doing. And Arthur Smith holding back against that was a hindrance to the offense in those final 5 weeks.
Yeah, I think Arthur Smith, really like any offensive coordinator, likes to have control of the offense, and he wants to know what's going to happen every single play, because if that play doesn't work out, let's say the quarterback changes a play and the OC doesn't call it, then the head coach is going to come back on the OC. So I get that aspect of it. But, after Gerry wrote his story, Chris, I went back and, looked at Arthur Smith's weekly transcripts. He meets with us every Thursday. And he was asked about this quite a lot during the season. I'm sure you remember.
Mm-hmm.
Basically what he said was, there's not a lot of QBs across the NFL who have the autonomy to change plays at the line of scrimmage. What's happening now is OCs are putting in checks for play. So if the play that he sends in doesn't work for that defense, the quarterback checks to another play. He does not have the power to change the play. I know a lot of people might not think that's a big deal, but it is a big deal. If you go back to the way Ben Roethlisberger operated during his prime, he had the freedom, to do a lot of stuff on his own. Different OC, different players around him. Guys were more experienced. So I think that was the disconnect there. And I get it from a certain point. Arthur knew he had a young offensive line. You have a receiver who's a bit, you can't count on him. So do you really want the quarterback to change plays when everyone might not be on the same page? I get it. But the timing of this, them coming off their best game of the season, really in a couple of seasons, and then the losing streak, not scoring 17 or more points after that, it doesn't look good for Arthur Smith.
No, it doesn't. And here's the other thing about this too, is that there's also more evidence. We remember that, Arthur Smith was very pro Justin Fields in the earlier part of the season when we were asking him about the potential transition up to a Russell Wilson. And Justin Fields revealed to us while he was still starting that he was not allowed to just change plays. All he could do was check into the other play that Arthur Smith had dialed up for that play, but he couldn't call an adjustment. Like if he saw, hey, they're leaving the inside part of this wide receiver who's split out wide open over there, I should check into a slant because there's a lot of space for him to run there. Nope, we're not going to do that. We're just going to go with the two plays Arthur Smith has. And listen, I can kind of understand it for Justin Fields, a guy who had 4 years in the NFL, didn't do well in those 4 years, and you were trying to make him a reclamation project, let him get his feet under himself in your new system. But when you have Russell Wilson, the guy with, 13 years of experience, the guy who's won a Super Bowl, the guy who's been to Pro Bowls after Pro Bowls, the guy that has read defense after defense, he's played every team in the NFL, and he's shown why he's a franchise quarterback, you do give them that liberties. That's what you're supposed to do. That was why Mike Tomlin brought him up in the first place. That was one of the things Mike Tomlin talked about was his ability to handle games in that situation. So for Arthur Smith to undermine Mike Tomlin in that way, it makes me ask big questions as far as what was the disconnect here that said, hey, the offense is working while you're doing this. I don't want it to work that way. I want it to work with how I'm calling the game exactly as I'm calling the game. And I feel like I just don't understand Arthur Smith's perspective on this. If all this is exactly that way, because no matter what was happening, we weren't questioning in Cincinnati if Arthur Smith was holding the offense back. We were saying, hey, obviously things are working because at that point of the season they were averaging like 28 points per game. You like that one with Russell Wilson. So for Arthur Smith to kind of sabotage this with saying, hey, I don't want you to be able to adjust my plays, it just seems like a backwards way of doing things when things were working.
Yeah, 2 points. The first was, in that Cincinnati game, Chris, you'll remember, it wasn't like Russ was checking off in the plays that were really dangerous. Yeah. What he was doing mostly was he was just dumping it off 5 yards beyond the line of scrimmage to a running back, and that running back had 10, 15, 20 yards of running room. So there was a weakness in that Bengals defense that they exploited. It wasn't like he was, we're going to change this play that Arthur called, and I'm going to chuck it deep into, into two deep safety looks. I mean, he wasn't doing that. Now, my other point, I'll push back on you against this, a little bit. I mean, Mike is the head coach. He had the power to stop that dynamic at any point during that 5-game losing streak. So part of me says, okay, well, Mike is aware that, Arthur maybe wants to micromanage this a little bit. He has to be aware of that dynamic in those meetings with Russ and with Arthur. So I really think if Mike wanted it to change, if he really wanted Russell to have that full autonomy at the line of scrimmage, it would have had to have happened, right? Like this couldn't have been.
No, I agree. I agree with that, right?
Yeah. So
I agree. I agree that Mike Tomlin should have stepped in front of that. But part of the narrative was we talked about it back then was, hey, Mike Tomlin needs to back off the offense and let Arthur Smith handle it. It was the opposite. Mike Tomlin shouldn't have backed off. He should have been like, no. I'm the person who brought in Russell Wilson, who said we're making this change. Because as we know, there were several people that were against it inside the organization. And we're pretty sure Arthur Smith was on that side of that because he talked glowingly of Justin Fields and downplayed Russell Wilson. I don't remember too many times that he spoke overwhelmingly glowingly about Russell Wilson. So I agree. Mike Tomlin should have stepped in the way of it, but I think that kind of shows that the dynamics that we were talking about, that, Mike Tomlin's the reason why this is happening. He's limiting the offense. It was Arthur Smith doing it. Mike Tomlin should have been putting his foot down to get in the way of Arthur Smith stopping what they were doing, because what Mike Tomlin said to do to switch it was working, and it was when they went against it that things went south. And I think that's where, maybe, the notion that he was being too overbearing and over controlling, maybe it was the reverse of that. Maybe he needed to be overbearing and over controlling in that situation.
Yeah, I think what it boils down to, Chris, is Russell wanted more freedom within the offense. And for whatever reason, whether it was just Art and Mike, there were reasons they didn't want that to happen. And we can take some educated guesses on why that is. We just touched on George Pickens. Can you count on him? Because for all of Antonio Brown's warts, he and Ben were on the same page
all the time,
99% of the time, right? Until 2018, until the big falling out. I mean, they had like this special chemistry that was unbelievable. Okay.
Yep.
And listen, that Ben had a veteran offensive line.
Mm-hmm.
These guys knew what to do. Totally different scenario with a rookie center, a very green right tackle in Broderick Jones. It's different, and maybe that's why Art and Mike, whoever was making these decisions, maybe that's why they kind of put the brakes on Russ and say, "Hey, we can't do this." And maybe the conversations were, "Listen, I get it. This makes sense from your perspective, but we don't have the pieces around you where everyone's going to be on the same page." So just trying to take some educated guesses as to why that might not happen. But when you go from 44 points, 17 points or fewer in your last 5 games, something stinks to high heaven.
It does. And it makes me question, does Russell Wilson want to come back to the Steelers? And, what is that dynamic?
He does, right?
He says he does. He says he does. And I get, and here's the other thing. I give Russell Wilson credit because for all like the little hints that we got from Arthur Smith, we never heard any of this from Russell Wilson. Like he was just like, "Hey guys, I'm going to do my best this week." And I think that's the infectious positivity that he has out. And sometimes that infectious positivity comes off like, "Leave me alone, Russ." When he's going up to Cam Hayward and said, "Hey, we just got to win 4 in a row," after they've just lost 4 in a row at the end of the Bengals game. So like, I get that's who Russell Wilson is, but I give Russell Wilson credit. If an offensive coordinator told me, a Super Bowl champion quarterback that just led you to 44 points, to stop adjusting plays, I might have had something to say about it. But he was very classy about it. Never let that get out. I give him credit for that. But you brought up George Pickens. That's where I want to go next because you wrote about him, and he is a big picture with whoever the quarterback is for starting for the Steelers next season. He's a big picture of how that needs to handle if he's going to be around. We'll talk about that next year on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But first, we'll remind you the show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you're injured in a car accident, you're probably wondering what's next. Well, for over 40 years, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injury victims answer that very question. Whether it's gathering evidence, collecting medical records, or dealing with the insurance companies, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped over 75,000 people handle the what's next question. Call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, I want to talk to you about your story on George Pickens and the decision the Steelers have to make, because this is not as open a decision, or this isn't as obvious a decision as the Steelers have had with some re-signings in the past, like when they re-signed TJ Watt or Alex Highsmith or Minkah Fitzpatrick or even Deontay Johnson. Though it didn't work out in the end, it was very clear at the time that Deontay Johnson was their best option to stick with at wide receiver, and he did provide some positives. But here they are with a fork in the road in between deciding, should they keep George Pickens, should they sign him long-term to a contract, or should they let him, should they trade him away, try to get some assets for him and handle this position? There's also the third where they just don't do anything and he just plays out his 4th year, and then they see about franchise tagging him. But let's examine you writing about this. You compared it to Tyreek Hill and how the Chiefs handled this. What do you think are the pros and the cons of trading George Pickens, and what kind of return could the Steelers get for a guy like that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the return goes, George is in the final year of his contract. But if you put him in the right system with the right quarterback, you could hit the jackpot. If you got, like, let's say, I don't know if the Steelers would trade him to the Kansas City Chiefs, but could you imagine Pickens in that offense? I mean, that could be really special. So, let's say a team like the Chiefs, maybe like a second and a 4th, or maybe if it's a team that's choosing in the middle of rounds, maybe it's just a second. I think that would be totally doable from both sides. I don't hold out any hope that he would draw, a first-round pick in return or anything like that, given his contract situation. But I do think you could get a decent return, a second or a third-round pick. Now, the pros would be obvious. Listen, he doesn't really fit in here. It doesn't really seem like he wants to be here. His teammates, if he's producing, it's they kind of hold their nose and they live with it. But when he doesn't, they know he can be a cancer on that football team. So, the pros would be, there's probably too many to list. Now, the cons would be, you look at the roster as it's constructed now, there's really no one else in that receivers room other than Calvin Austin III in Roman Wilson, who are definitely going to be back. So you would have to invest in free agency. You would have to invest resources in the draft. I think they're going to do that anyway, just because that receivers room is so depleted. But when I weigh the pros and the cons, Chris, I mean, I got the pros up here, and I think the cons are kind of
the scales of the scales of Fittipaldo. I love it. Okay. So your point 100% about George Pickens, like we've seen it. We've seen, you and I, we're in the locker room and you're in it more than I am, but we've seen the players, like even before this year, when we were talking about last year, when players were talking about like, hey, guys got to be focused in on practice. And we're all kind of like looking over like, I think they're talking about 14 over there. There's been those situations. The Steelers, they've been trying to reset the nucleus of leadership in their offensive side of things for a while. That's what they tried with Najee Harris. That's what they tried with Kenny Pickett. That's what they're trying to do with this offensive line right now. They're trying to find guys. That's what they were hoping to do with Russell Wilson as well. So I get I get that, like, hey, if you're going to do that, I think that there's going to be, I think you got to take the challenges that they come with it. And part of that is you need to get commitment from your best players. And the George Pickens right now is undoubtedly the most talented guy in the offense. No one doubts that about him. But if you want your offense to move forward, you need that guy to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And when he's coming late to Christmas Day games, when he's coming, when he's a guy that you're not always in tune with, and guys do have to kind of bite their tongue when they're talking about commitment and working things, that's not helping the situation. But to your point also, it's not like the Steelers have some sort of, don't have like the next wide receiver in hand right now. And so now you got to look at, if you trade them away, and if we look at two other huge names the Steelers have traded away while they were while they were, a pretty big name in the NFL. You go back to Antonio Brown. They got a third and a fifth round pick from him when they traded him to the Raiders. Much better than the return than they got from trading away Santonio Holmes 2 years after his Super Bowl MVP, when they traded him away for a fifth round pick. So, like you said, I don't expect a first, and maybe even a second is too much, considering he is a rental and people kind of know about his situation. But either way, if you can get a second or a third and some change off of that, you can use that capital to go get your wide receiver in this draft class, because this is a good wide receiver draft class early, not as much late. And if you do this, you could also use it in the trade capital to go get your next wide receiver, maybe somewhere in the NFL. And we'll talk about some of those players next. But I think that the Steelers, they're not in a position where they should feel stuck with George Pickens if they don't want him.
Yeah, I mean, listen, put yourself in the shoes of one of the players in the Steelers locker room and somebody on offense, right? Mm-hmm. We know about the lack of effort going back to that Colts game last year, not blocking. Plenty of mental errors, not running routes, quitting on routes, however you want to frame that. And then this guy shows up for work every day, or on most days at 10 o'clock, mm-hmm. when everybody else is there at 7:30 or 8 mm-hmm. for that first team meeting of the day. So you can imagine, what they say to us, but is different. They're always going to have the backs of their teammates, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking, we can't win with this guy. How are we going to build a winning team when this guy is behaving in this manner? So, I mean, you bring up that third option. They can simply have him play out the rookie, the last year of his rookie deal. But I think you're asking for trouble, Chris, if you do that. I mean, I think we've seen he's a pain in the neck the first 3 seasons. It could get even worse if he knows he's not going to come back here. So, some people might say, he's going to contract year, he's going to ball out. Do we really know
this was that year?
Yeah. Do we really know that?
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah. So, you're right. Like if he wanted to be with the Steelers, last year was the year to shape up and to ball out. Now he would be doing it to ball out for a free agent deal. Yeah, I mean, I get that, but I just don't think that George cares. Like he's given away hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines to the NFL and back to the Steelers. He just doesn't care. So why should we think he's going to care about a future big deal with whoever after the 2025 season?
No, I'm right with you, Ray. I don't know if why that would change there. But again, you look at the situation here. If you're the Steelers, letting him stick around. How many times have we seen, Deontay Johnson, TJ Watt, Minka Fitzpatrick, Alex Heisman, all of them did those hold-ins where they'd be at practice. What will George Pickens do? Will he do a hold-in? Will he do a straight-up hold-out and not even show up for training camp? And that would be a big story.
Yeah,
he could be Le'Veon Bell. And you covered that. That was a nightmare for 3 months. They waited for that for him to not show up, never play, and then just have to move on from having one of the best running backs in football. They can't afford to put themselves in that kind of a situation this time around. Yeah,
and for people who don't know, like Le'Veon Bell still never got a year of NFL credit for that season. His contract told. That did not go toward his pension. That was just a move in spite to say, I'm going to challenge the way these NFL contracts are written. And, in the end, Le'Veon Bell lost. But listen, George Pickens, it would be foolish for us to say they could look back on that or have their agents look back on that and realize it was a mistake. People always feel like they have the power. And I wouldn't be surprised if George felt like he had the power in that situation too.
Absolutely. So that's the big question the Steelers have to answer right now. And listen, I'm not saying George Pickens is definitely out the door. Maybe they have had this conversation with him and they feel like they've made a connection with him that we don't see as part of what happens in the early part of the offseason. There's conversations that we're not privy to in the exit interviews, but it is a challenge that they have to take on, whether it is a decision to keep him for the long term, whether it's holding out and just seeing what happens this year, or whether it's moving on from him. All those options are on the table. There are NFL players that can be traded for. I want to talk about one of those players who became available this week. We'll talk about that next year on the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you the show is also brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda, where you can get to your new Honda vehicle at 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, PA, or visit their website at moonhonda.com. Here's a message from our friends at Moon Township Honda.
We gave the all-electric Prologue EX class-leading passenger space. And we made its tech intuitive with Google built-in. Perhaps that's why we were named Best Overall EV and Hybrid Brand by Kelley Blue Book. It's nice when a dream comes together. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, want to talk to you about some of the players the Steelers could be looking at in the trade market. One of the big names that came up this week was the Rams, who made it public, and Cooper Kupp made it public that Cooper Kupp is on the table. Now, Cooper Kupp's in a unique position. He did once lead the NFL in receiving receptions, and he was fantastic in 2021. But since then, he has had years of just being injured. He hasn't played more than 12 games in the season since then, and he's going to be 32 this season. Right. There's a lot of big questions about that. He's also been primarily used in the slot by the Rams. And I know that he's 6'2", and technically maybe he could still play outside, but I feel like the Steelers have enough slot receivers. They need, if they're going to go get trade for a guy, I think it needs to be a guy who A, hasn't been injured a lot recently, B, maybe a little bit younger, and C, can definitely play outside and be more of a playmaker there rather than more of a slot guy who's shifty and route run and like a route runner. That's what you're hoping to get out of Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson next season.
Yeah, the way this was presented by the Rams and Cooper Kupp, it's everyone's going to be gunning for him in a trade. Well, what team out there, Chris, is going to want to absorb $24 million in salary and bonuses that he's owed on that contract that Les Snead did? You said it. The reason the Rams are getting rid of him is because he's off injured. He's turning 32, and that he's got a $26 million cap hit for the 2025 season. So I think in the end, what we're looking at here is probably going to be released. Or if there is a deal, because if he's released, Chris, then he's a free agent. He can sign with whoever he wants, and these teams can get him for much cheaper, I think. Now, the only way it would make sense, to trade him would be if you really think that, and this would have to be worked out with Kupp and his agents, but if you think that you think he's going to be a hot commodity, then you trade for him like the Steelers did with Dante Jackson and Deontay Johnson, and then you redo the contract once he's there. Dante Jackson was owed, I think, over $10 million on the last year of his contract with the Panthers. But when he signed with the Steelers, they tore that up with his understanding and his approval, and that came down to $6 million. So I don't know what the value is for Cooper Kupp. It's certainly not $24.5 million, that he's owed in 2025. So, is he worth it for 15? I mean, the reason I would want him, Chris, is you want an adult in the room. He's a pro, right? I mean, he's a guy who could lead a young receiving corps. You want to pay as much as $15 million for that, and for a guy who's maybe at the end? I don't know, but for me, it would be attractive from that perspective. And he's going to be motivated, and maybe he thinks, he's got something left in the tank, and he wants to prove that. So I think there are reasons that I would maybe explore that if he does get cut. But I'm not paying him, 18, 20, 24 million, whatever, his contract was this year.
And I think that's the thing here, is that everyone kind of recognizes that, that this is where the struggles are going to be. If you go get a Cooper Kupp, you have those questions. But like you said, the benefits are you get a leader, you get a guy who's done it, an adult in the room who can set a better tone. And I think that there's the questions here, but then there's also the questions of what other players might be out there. Because Ray, how many times have you covered free agency and the people that you're talking about in January and February aren't the people who are available in March? Because there's tons of moves that happen. Like right now, T. Higgins is technically set to be a free agent, but as you and I have talked about, he could very well just easily be franchise tagged by the Bengals and then traded by then to teams like the Steelers and Ravens. Don't get their crack at T. Higgins in free agency. And then you also have other players out there that could be on the trade market that could be available. Guys like Cortland Sutton, who the Steelers were interested in with the Broncos. Guy like Christian Kirk, who was almost a Steeler if it wasn't for his broken collarbone with the Jaguars. There's guys like that available that the Steelers, I think, are going to be taking a look at. How big of a player do you think the Steelers would be in that kind of a trade market?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, the biggest name out there other than T. Higgins, Tyreek Hill, said he wants to be traded. I mean, they wouldn't want to go after Tyreek Hill because, of the contract. But the point is, whatever team acquires Tyreek Hill, then there's going to be domino effects, right? They might have to cut a receiver who's under contract, and however that would work. So, yeah, I mean, for a guy like Cortland Sutton, now is DK Metcalf, is he under contract or is he a free agent?
I think under contract, but
okay. So that would be another trade. So we're all talking about guys, probably late 20s, early 30s, guys who have been around. I don't know Cortland Sutton's age. He's maybe a little bit younger. He might be 26, 27. So, I mean, ideally, Chris, when you go out and acquire free agents or you acquire them in a trade, you want to get them after that first contract, when they're first entering their prime, so you're getting your best years. Now, the caveat with that, of course, is you're going to pay for that, right?
Yeah,
T. Higgins is a really good player, but you're going to have to pay him $25-27 million a year for him to be on your football team. So there's always some give and take. I mean, the way I'm looking at it right now, and we'll get to talk to Omar at the Combine here in a couple of weeks, I think it probably will be a free agent, veteran receiver. And then I think they will invest early in the draft. I don't know about first round, but definitely first 2 days of the draft, I think they'll go out and get a receiver to go along with Roman Wilson, Calvin Austin, and to further, boost that receivers room.
No, I think that's the move too here. Like you add in free agency, you add in the draft, and then you see what you did with George Pickens. Because here's the other thing: if you trade away George Pickens, most likely you're also getting at least a day 2 pick. You're hoping in that process, and if you're getting a second or third round pick there for that, that adds to your equations as far as how you go after wide receiver. And we have plenty of time to talk about how wide receiver is going to work in this draft class. There's guys definitely available in the first round, guys that should be available in the second round, but after that, are you going to be able to find impact guys in this draft class? We'll have plenty of time to talk about that, but certainly wide receiver is an open thing right now. And Ray, before we go, I wanted to ask your opinion on something that also happened while in between our recording of our Monday show and this show. Another big player on the trade market supposedly is Myles Garrett. Not that the Steelers are going to be interested in him, but of course that's an immediate impact because he's been probably the best defensive player that they've gone up against in the past several years. And he's now saying that he wants to be traded away from the Browns. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, will that actually happen? The Browns have said they're not taking any calls right now. Yeah. I'm sorry, but I'm calling their bluff. I think that's them trying to not get hosed in the trade deal as best as they can. But what's your take on Myles Garrett saying, I want to get out of Cleveland?
Yeah, I mean, if I was the GM of the Browns, I would be driving to drive that price up as much as anyone. I get that. Yeah, you put out the word, we're not going to trade him, but then when you talk to these other teams, you say, hey, what would it take? So I would shoot for the stars. There's that Khalil Mack deal that's kind of been used as a comp. I forget exactly what that was. I want to say it was 2 firsts and maybe some other draft picks that were involved in that trade. Now, Khalil Mack was 27. I think Myles Garrett is 29. So there is a little bit of a difference there. But let's say they do get hosed in the trade market and teams are trying to lowball them. Forget it. Bring them back. Force him to play. He's got 2 years left on his contract, Chris. I mean, what's he going to do? Give away all that money? I mean, he's on the books for $30 million a year. He'll be costing himself $2 million a game if he tries to sit out. So I would call his bluff. The only way that I would deal him is if I get a ton of return, in a potential trade.
That'd be the big thing there. Do the Browns get a big return there? They certainly could use some assets if they're moving forward because of the way that Deshaun Watson trade played out. We'll see how all that handles it out throughout the rest of the offseason. Keep it here with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm Chris Carter. He's Ray Fittipaldo. Thank you all for tuning in to the North Shore Drive podcast. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get all of your Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Back here Friday with more from the North Shore Drive podcast. We'll see you here, right here. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.